In the sweltering dawn of June 15, 1898, American soldiers in Cuba were not dying from Spanish bullets. They were being poisoned by their own provisions, one tin at a time. The sun had not yet breached the horizon, but the air was already thick enough to choke on, a suffocating blanket of tropical humidity that clung to sweat-soaked uniforms like a second skin. The camp at Santiago de Cuba sprawled across a clearing that had been hacked from the jungle with machetes and determination, but nature was already reclaiming its territory. Mist rose from makeshift tents that sagged under the weight of accumulated moisture, their canvas walls dark with stains that spoke of too many men living too close together for too long. The ropes creaked softly in the pre-dawn stillness, as if the camp itself was groaning under the weight of what was about to unfold. Around sputtering fires that provided more smoke than warmth, exhausted soldiers gathered in a silence that felt older than the war itself. These were volunteers from farms and factories, men who had answered the call to liberate Cuba from Spanish tyranny, fueled by the jingoistic headlines of the yellow press and dreams of martial glory. Instead, they found themselves rotting in foreign mud, their eyes swollen with fever and fatigue, their lips cracked from brackish water and coffee that had been boiled too many times in blackened tin cups. They moved with mechanical obedience now, not from discipline, but from the simple recognition that hunger commanded more authority than any officer. Private James O'Connell of the 71st New York Volunteers dragged a wooden crate forward, its stenciled letters blurred by travel and tropical moisture. The word rations was still visible on the splintered lid, along with the patriotic eagle and the reassuring promise, United States Army provisions, inspected and approved. He wedged the edge of his bayonet under the lid and pried it open with a sound like breaking bones. Inside, neat rows of government-issued tins gleamed faintly in the early light, each one bearing the industrial promise of sustenance, of civilization packaged and shipped across an ocean to feed the sons of democracy. The ritual that followed had become a grim lottery. O'Connell jammed the point of his bayonet under the lip of his can and wrenched it open. The scene groaned in protest, then surrendered with a wet hiss that released something far worse than mere air. The smell arrived before the sight, faint at first, almost indistinguishable from the surrounding rot of latrines and garbage pits, but then sharpening into something that made experienced soldiers recoil. It was sickly sweet and metallic, medicinal in a way that belonged in morgues rather than mess kits. What emerged was not food in any recognizable sense. The contents slid out with obscene slowness, holding the shape of the can for a moment before slumping into something for which the human language lacked adequate words. It was gray with a peculiar iridescent sheen, as though oil had been painted thinly across its surface and left a rainbow in the tropical light. The texture was wrong, yielding yet resistant, like something that wanted to dissolve but refused to surrender completely. Sergeant William Dougherty, a 15-year veteran of frontier campaigns, would later testify before Congress that it felt slippery as a corpse, meat that seemed to dissolve on contact with saliva rather than yield to chewing. Flies appeared almost instantly, as if summoned from the very air itself. They descended in clouds so thick they seemed to darken patches of the camp, their bodies vibrating in frantic ecstasy as they recognized death in its chemically preserved form. The buzzing became a constant accompaniment to the morning's horror, a soundtrack of decay that no amount of swatting could silence. The men ate because they had to. Driven by the primal need for calories, they cut off small pieces, held their breath, and pushed the substance past parched throats. The taste was worse than the smell, rancid fat masked clumsily by chemicals that left numbness on the tongue and a metallic echo that lingered behind the teeth. One soldier muttered that it tasted like a surgeon's table smells. Another whispered that it reminded him of the fluid used to preserve corpses. They were tasting formaldehyde, borax, salicylic acid, chemicals designed to prevent decay regardless of what they might do to the living humans who consumed them. Within minutes, the camp began to answer with a symphony of suffering. Private O'Connell dropped his spoon and doubled over, hands gripping his stomach as if trying to hold something inside that was determined to escape. A thin, involuntary cry escaped him before he clapped a fist to his mouth and staggered away, boots slipping in the wet dirt. Behind the cook fires, another soldier pushed himself up too quickly, dizziness washing over him in waves. His face had turned the waxy color of old lard. He managed 3 steps before emptying the contents of his stomach onto the ground with a violence that shook his entire frame. It spread like a contagion of betrayal. Men who had survived weeks of tropical disease suddenly clutched their sides, their malnourished bodies racked by convulsions that seemed to tear them apart from within. The sound of retching multiplied until it became a grotesque chorus, the wet splatter of vomit hitting mud, the choked gasps of men unable to catch their breath between spasms, the whispered curses against suppliers whose names they had trusted like prayers. Dr. Edward Kirschner, the regimental surgeon, hurried from tent to tent with his canvas satchel bumping against his hip, and his expression already resigned to witnessing something beyond his power to heal. He had no medicine for this, no remedy except to document the horror unfolding before him. As he knelt beside soldiers who lay trembling in their own filth, he detected a peculiar sweet chemical odor on their breath, a scent that reminded him not of any kitchen, but of the preparation rooms where undertakers worked their preservative arts upon the dead. The whispered curses that began that morning would echo through congressional hearing rooms and newspaper headlines for years to come. They were not curses against Spanish generals or tropical diseases, but against the industrial titans who had transformed patriotism into profit margins. One name surfaced more frequently than others, spoken with particular venom by men who had trusted their nation to feed them properly. Armour. Philip Danforth Armour of Chicago, the meat king whose empire had built its fortune on the promise of abundance, had delivered to the United States Army hundreds of thousands of pounds of beef treated with chemicals that would have been rejected for embalming the dead. 2,000 miles north, in a fortress of marble and mahogany on Chicago's Prairie Avenue, Philip Danforth Armour slept soundly in silk sheets, counting the millions earned from the very contracts that were killing American boys in foreign mud. His mansion stood as a monument to industrial triumph, each room a testament to the fortune that could be extracted from the mechanization of death. The house was a sanctuary in every sense, walls thick enough to muffle the sounds of the city, gates designed to keep the masses at respectful distance, windows that filtered out the smoke and stench of the Union stock yards where his empire was built on the bones of 9 million animals annually. Here, the air did not smell of rot or chemical preservatives. It smelled of beeswax polish, fresh linen, and the faint expensive aroma of Turkish tobacco. When Armour descended to his dining room that morning, he entered a study in controlled opulence. Crystal chandeliers cast fractured light across mahogany panels that had been imported from forests that took centuries to grow, illuminating a table that groaned under the weight of perfectly prepared breakfast, eggs, breads, fruit brought from distant orchards, and, of course, meat. Sausages and bacon that bore his name, cooked to perfection, emitting scents that suggested abundance, comfort, and domestic peace. There was no iridescent sheen here, no flies, no chemical tang. The silverware gleamed, the porcelain was delicate and imported, and everything set before him had been curated, selected, refined for a palate that would never be asked to consume the products shipped to soldiers in distant jungles. On his desk lay the papers of empire, telegrams, ledgers, correspondence that included figures from government contracts, representing tons of beef supplied to the United States Army. To him, they were merely lines of ink, comforting in their regularity, proof that his dynasty was secure, and that the fortress he had built with slaughter and efficiency would stand for generations. He could not hear the retching in Cuban mud or see young soldiers cursing his name between bouts of chemical poisoning. The ocean, the railroads, and the distances of class and fortune conspired to protect him from the immediate consequences of his industrial success. He had revolutionized American industry with his disassembly line, transforming the messy business of death into clockwork precision that could process a living animal into packaged commodity in minutes. But in his relentless pursuit of efficiency, he had forgotten the most fundamental principle of commerce, that trust, once poisoned, proves far more difficult to preserve than meat. The chemicals that extended the shelf life of his products were simultaneously dissolving the foundation of his reputation, one contaminated tin at a time. He had built an empire on the promise of feeding the nation, on the democratic ideal that even the poor could afford meat once reserved for the wealthy. His name had become synonymous with American abundance, with the industrial miracle that could slaughter cattle in Illinois and feed soldiers in tropical jungles. But that humid Cuban morning revealed a darker truth. Sometimes the greatest danger comes not from the enemy's sword, but from the Allies' supper. The soldiers who opened those tins had trusted in American industry, in the patriotic rhetoric that accompanied every government contract, in the assumption that their nation would not poison them in the name of profit. The question that would haunt a dynasty was already forming in those dying soldiers' throats, whispered between bouts of retching, carved into letters that would eventually reach Congress and horrify a nation. What exactly had America been swallowing? Not just in Cuba, but in every home where tins bearing the armor name sat in pantries, every breakfast table where his products sizzled in cast-iron pans, every frontier store where pioneers purchased his provisions for journeys into uncertain territory. If the United States Army, with its inspectors and regulations and oversight, could be fed poison wrapped in patriotic labels, what horrors were being consumed by ordinary citizens who had no recourse, no voice, no way to know what chemicals were preserving their daily bread? The empire built on efficiency and abundance was about to learn that some stains cannot be washed away by philanthropy or public relations, that trust once contaminated spreads faster than any chemical preservative, and that the true cost of feeding a nation on lies would be measured not in dollars, but in the slow, inexorable rot of a reputation that had taken decades to build and would crumble in a single, poisonous dawn. Philip Danforth Armour understood a fundamental truth that separated the wealthy from the merely ambitious. In America, fortunes are not built on what people want, but on what they cannot live without. He emerged from the kind of Presbyterian soil that bred both saints and sinners, born in 1832 to farmers in Stockbridge, New York, where the earth yielded more stones than grain, and survival was a daily negotiation with an indifferent God. The Armour family worked land that seemed cursed by its own stubbornness, their hands cracking in winter cold and blistering in summer heat for harvests that barely sustained life, let alone prosperity. Young Philip absorbed the harsh arithmetic of rural poverty, that virtue without vision was merely decorated suffering, and that the righteous poor remained poor not because they lacked character, but because they lacked the ruthless clarity to see opportunity where others saw only hardship. At 20 years old, as California gold fever swept the nation like a contagion of hope, Philip made the decision that would define his philosophy. He would go west, but not to dig. While newspapers printed breathless accounts of nuggets plucked from streams by lucky prospectors, Philip saw something more valuable than gold dust. He saw thousands of desperate men who would need to eat, drink, and equip themselves in a landscape that offered nothing but the chance to supply such necessities at premium prices. The overland journey to California in 1852 was itself an education in human frailty and market dynamics. For months, Philip endured alkali dust that burned the throat, contaminated water that killed the weak, and the constant specter of disease that transformed the westward trail into an unmarked cemetery. But where others saw suffering, he saw instruction. He watched men pay outrageous sums for basic provisions, observed how desperation made them surrender their last coins for a pound of flour or a canteen of clean water. He understood with crystalline clarity that in environments of scarcity, the man who controlled supply controlled destiny itself. In the chaotic mining camps of Placerville, while thousands bent their backs panning streams that had already surrendered their treasures to earlier arrivals, Philip Armour established a provision business with methodical precision. He sold shovels to men who would find nothing, water to those dying of thirst, and salt pork to miners whose bodies demanded protein they could neither hunt nor grow. His prices were inflated to the point of extortion, but hunger has no pride, and thirst acknowledges no principles. A man might curse the cost while counting out his coins, but he would pay nonetheless, because Philip had positioned himself between necessity and survival. The education was not merely in accumulation, but in recognition. American capitalism, he realized, rewarded not those who produced value, but those who positioned themselves between fundamental needs and desperate consumers. In 4 years of such calculated commerce, he amassed $8,000, a fortune that would have required his father 3 lifetimes to extract from reluctant New York soil. When he finally turned back east in 1856, he carried not gold dust won by luck, but hard currency earned through the cold, precise understanding of human desperation. The Civil War provided the next classroom in his education of American appetite. Settling in Milwaukee with his brother's modest grain business, Philip brought capital and something far more dangerous, ambition tempered by frontier pragmatism. By 1863, the conflict had devolved into a grinding war of attrition that consumed men and materials with industrial hunger. Both Union and Confederate armies needed meat in quantities that strained traditional supply chains, driving pork prices to $40 per barrel as demand outpaced supply. While conventional wisdom suggested prices would continue climbing until the war's conclusion, Philip studied the strategic situation with the analytical detachment of a general. He concluded that the conflict would end suddenly, and when it did, military demand would evaporate overnight, sending prices into catastrophic collapse. So he executed a maneuver that scandalized his conservative partners. He sold short, contracting to deliver thousands of barrels of pork at current inflated prices months in the future, betting that by delivery time he could purchase the same pork for far less than his contracted price. When the Confederacy surrendered at Appomattox in April 1865, pork prices plummeted exactly as Philip had predicted, falling from $40 to $18 per barrel. He purchased the pork needed to fulfill his contracts at the collapsed price, pocketing the $22 difference on thousands of barrels. In a matter of weeks, he transformed the nation's bloodiest tragedy into personal triumph, making his first killing, literally and figuratively, by profiting from the hunger of armies while soldiers starved in trenches and families mourned their dead. With millions in capital and unshakable confidence in his instincts, Armour turned his attention to Chicago, the rising leviathan of the Midwest, where all rail lines converged like iron arteries, feeding a continental heart. In 1875, he established his operations at the newly formed Union Stockyards, a sprawling 325-acre complex that would become both his cathedral and his fortress. Here was industrial poetry made manifest, a city within a city where 40,000 animals arrived daily by rail, were processed with mechanical efficiency, and departed as packaged commodities destined for tables across the nation. Armour's genius lay not in slaughter itself. Men had been killing animals for food since civilization's dawn, but in the mechanization and systematization of death. He pioneered the disassembly line, a concept that would later inspire Henry Ford's automobile assembly process. Where Ford would build cars from components moving along a line, Armour disassembled animals with clockwork precision, each worker performing a single repetitive task as carcasses moved past on hooks and conveyors. The efficiency was breathtaking and terrible. A living hog entered his facility and emerged 15 minutes later as ham, bacon, lard, bristles for brushes, bones for fertilizer, and a dozen other products, each packaged and priced. Nothing was wasted. Blood became fertilizer, bones became buttons, hooves became glue. "I use everything but the squeal," he boasted, a phrase that captured both his ingenuity and his terrifying efficiency. Death had been transformed into dividends with mathematical precision. By 1890, Philip Armour stood at his zenith. He commanded an industrial leviathan that employed 25,000 workers, a population larger than most American cities, and processed 9 million animals annually. His personal fortune exceeded $100 million, placing him among the wealthiest men in America. His name had become synonymous with abundance: canned beef for pioneers pushing westward, bacon for breakfast tables from New York to San Francisco, prosperity for shareholders whose dividends flowed as regularly as the Chicago River. The Armour mansion on Prairie Avenue stood as physical testimony to the distance he had traveled from his father's failing farm. 3 stories of marble and mahogany-housed rooms, filled with European art and furniture, a private library, and a ballroom that could accommodate Chicago's entire elite. He genuinely believed himself a benefactor, a patriarch who had solved the ancient problem of feeding the masses through the miracle of industrial capitalism. The Armour Institute educated working-class children. The Armour mission fed the destitute, and countless charitable contributions flowed from his fortune like tributaries of benevolence. Yet beneath this gilded prosperity, something was already corrupting. The very scale that generated wealth was beginning to detach him from the reality of his product. When you process 9 million animals annually, a single cow ceases to be a living creature and becomes a unit of production. When efficiency demands speed above scrutiny, when refrigerated cars must be filled and contracts met regardless of condition, the line between industrial progress and criminal negligence begins to blur with dangerous subtlety. The disassembly line demanded relentless pace. Diseased cattle could not pause the process for inspection. Spoiled meat could not halt the machinery for disposal. Chemical preservatives, formaldehyde, borax, salicylic acid, became not adulterants but solutions, ways to maintain the flow of product that sustained the flow of profit that fed the machinery of empire. He had transformed killing into an art form, death into dividends. But in his relentless pursuit of efficiency, he had forgotten the most dangerous ingredient in any empire: the moment when profit becomes more sacred than the product itself. That moment had already arrived, though from his marble fortress on Prairie Avenue, surrounded by the insulation of wealth and the deference of subordinates, Philip Armour could not yet see the poison spreading through his perfect system. The machine he had built with such precision was about to consume not just animals, but the reputation and dynasty he had spent a lifetime constructing. In 1884, Philip Armour made a decision that would define American industry and damn his legacy. He decided that speed mattered more than scrutiny, efficiency more than ethics. The decision arrived not as dramatic proclamation, but as incremental accommodation, the slow erosion of standards that occurs when profit margins speak louder than principles. For years, the slaughterhouses of Chicago had been places of brute force and rough improvisation, skilled butchers spending hours breaking down individual carcasses, selecting cuts with care, discarding what was unfit. Armour looked at this tradition and saw only waste, minutes bleeding away into hours, potential profit evaporating in the pauses between knife strokes. His solution was to mechanize slaughter with the same relentless logic that railroads applied to distance. Inside the vast, humid caverns of the Union Stock Yards, beneath ceilings obscured by steam and smoke, he engineered a choreography of death that was as terrifying as it was innovative. The process began with gravity and momentum. Cattle were driven up long wooden chutes to the killing floors, stunned by a sledgehammer blow, then hoisted by a hind leg onto an overhead trolley system that never stopped moving. From that moment, the animal ceased to be a biological entity and became raw material in motion. It was industrial poetry, precise, profitable, and profoundly disturbing. Overhead rails gleamed under gaslight that flickered against damp brick walls, creating a cathedral of mechanization where death had been stripped of its chaos and dressed in the garments of order. Workers in blood-stained aprons moved with choreographed efficiency, their faces empty of emotion because emotion was inefficient. And inefficiency was the only unforgivable sin in Armour's empire. A living hog entered the facility and emerged 15 minutes later as ham, bacon, lard, sausage casings, bristles for brushes, bones for fertilizer, and a dozen other products, each wrapped and labeled with the Armour name that promised quality and American abundance. The mechanization was so complete that Henry Ford himself would later visit these facilities and carry away inspiration for his automobile assembly lines, recognizing in Armour's disassembly process the fundamental principle that would revolutionize manufacturing. But what worked for steel and rubber carried darker implications when applied to flesh. The disassembly line demanded absolute consistency of pace, a ceaseless flow that transformed the chaotic reality of biology into the predictable certainty of commerce. But speed demanded shortcuts, and shortcuts in the meat industry are measured in bacterial growth and hidden disease. When cattle arrived showing signs of illness, clouded eyes, labored breathing, lesions on hides, tubercular nodes swelling in their necks, the traditional response was quarantine and veterinary examination. But quarantine meant delay, and delay meant empty hooks on the disassembly line, which meant workers standing idle, which meant money hemorrhaging from the system. The sheer velocity of the process made scrutiny impossible. When a carcass swung past a worker every 10 seconds, there was simply no time to question its quality. So the standards shifted imperceptibly. The first compromises were so small they scarcely registered as decisions. Diseased cattle weren't always discarded. They were processed faster before inspectors could intervene with inconvenient questions about fitness for human consumption. A cow trembling with fever was simply another unit on a relentlessly moving line. Stopping the process would mean halting dozens of workers, disrupting schedules, missing rail connections. The logic was seductive in its simplicity. Cooking would kill whatever pathogens infected the meat, and the American appetite was large enough to absorb occasional complaints without threatening the broader enterprise. Then came the chemical revolution that would ultimately poison everything. As Armour's empire expanded, shipping meat across a continent required preservation methods that went beyond traditional salting or smoking. Refrigeration was still imperfect. Ice cars often failed in summer heat, leaving tons of beef rotting on sidings in Kansas or Nebraska. To discard this spoiled inventory would mean accepting loss, and Philip Armour did not accept loss. Instead, he turned to chemistry. In secret rooms within the packing plants, men mixed powders into water, white crystalline substances with names that belonged in mortuaries, not kitchens. Borax to arrest decay. Formaldehyde to preserve tissue indefinitely. Salicylic acid to mask the taste of incipient rot. Sulfurous acid to kill surface bacteria. These were the new tools of the trade, the preservatives that could take meat that was gray, slimy, and beginning to smell of decomposition, and restore it to a semblance of freshness. A bath in these chemical solutions would kill the surface bacteria, remove the odor, and return a bright, unnatural red color to the flesh. The fact that these same chemicals were used to embalm corpses and preserve biological specimens in medical schools was conveniently overlooked. The fact that workers who handled these preservatives developed sores on their hands that refused to heal, complained of headaches and dizziness, and suffered a constant metallic taste in their mouths was attributed to general industrial hazards. When meat arrived at its destination with a peculiar chemical sheen or an odd medicinal taste, it was marketed as evidence of modern preservation techniques rather than acknowledged as contamination. From Armour's mahogany-paneled boardroom, he reviewed ledgers that showed profit margins climbing like fever charts, each quarter surpassing the last in a trajectory that seemed to confirm the righteousness of his methods. The numbers were beautiful in their abstraction: tonnage processed, revenue generated, dividends distributed. They told a story of unqualified success, but numbers are cruel simplifiers. They cannot capture the texture of meat that has been chemically treated to disguise decay. They do not record the complaints of customers who reported strange tastes or subsequent illness. The psychological turning point came when the first complaints began to trickle back to Chicago like isolated raindrops on a summer afternoon. A grocer in St. Louis wrote to say that several customers had fallen ill after eating canned beef from an Armour shipment. A railway cook in Kansas sent back a crate of hams with a note describing them as off in color and strange in odor. A small-town doctor in Iowa inquired whether any changes had been made in the curing process. His patients were suffering unexplained stomach ailments after meals featuring Armour pork. These letters made their way to Chicago, where clerks logged them in ledgers and filed them away. Armour reads summaries prepared by intermediaries, the sting of criticism softened by layers of interpretation. At some point, perhaps reading a report of yet another complaint, perhaps staring at a column of figures that showed exponential growth, a subtle shift occurred in his mind. Complaints stopped being warnings and became obstacles. They were not signs that something was fundamentally wrong with his product. They were inconveniences to be managed, minimized, explained away. His response was not to investigate, but to market. If customers doubted the wholesomeness of canned meat, the answer was patriotic advertising that associated his products with progress, strength, and national destiny. Full-page newspaper ads extolled the cleanliness of Chicago's modern facilities, the scientific precision of refrigeration and processing, the trustworthiness of a name that had fed the Republic. The narrative became more important than the reality. The product became secondary to the promise. Within the plants, the moral blindness deepened systematically. Workers who fell ill from inhaling chemical fumes or handling diseased meat were dismissed as constitutionally weak and replaced by fresh immigrants waiting at the gates. Middle managers, eager to meet targets and avoid the displeasure of Chicago's most formidable industrial baron, made compromises without direct orders. When inspectors hesitated to pass questionable shipments, they were reminded, politely at first, then with growing insistence, that delays were costly, that minor illnesses in animals did not always translate into danger for the consumer. The early incidents accumulated like sediment, each one isolated, explained away, buried in paperwork that never reached Armour's desk. There were reports of downer cattle, animals too sick to walk, being dragged to the killing floor at night to avoid inspection. Cattle with visible tubercular lesions were processed anyway because the veterinary inspector had not yet arrived for his weekly rounds. Meat that had begun to spoil in transit was treated with extra preservatives and shipped to distant markets, where complaints would take weeks to filter back through distribution channels. A hotel in Cincinnati reported an entire banquet laid low by what guests described as tainted roast beef. Each incident was treated as an aberration, a local problem, a misunderstanding. He had surrounded himself with men who understood their role in this sanctuary of denial, accountants who converted suffering into tidy figures, lawyers who could wrap ethical rot in legal language, executives who signed contracts they would never have to personally fulfill. Together, they built a cocoon of rationalizations that kept the stench of their own practices from reaching their nostrils. The system operated like a massive flywheel that, once set in motion, could not be stopped without catastrophic disruption to the profits that shareholders had come to expect with the regularity of seasonal harvests. Success had insulated Armour from consequence. Wealth had created distance between decision and outcome. He signed contracts for millions of pounds of beef without ever smelling the chemical preservatives or tasting the peculiar metallic tang that characterized his products. He approved cost-cutting measures without witnessing workers fainting on floors slick with blood and chemicals. He dismissed complaints without meeting the families who had been sickened by his provisions. Philip Armour had created a machine so efficient it could transform anything into profit: diseased cattle, spoiled meat, even poison itself. The disassembly line operated with such relentless momentum that nothing could stop it. Not moral qualms, not customer complaints, not the mounting evidence that something fundamental had gone wrong in the pursuit of efficiency. He believed he had conquered the biological limitations of food, that chemistry and speed could outrun the natural laws of decay. But machines, no matter how perfect, eventually break down. And when they do, they tend to break down spectacularly, with consequences that cascade through every system they have touched, destroying not just themselves, but the reputations and fortunes of those who built them with such confidence in their own infallibility. By 1895, Philip Armour had perfected the most dangerous art of the Gilded Age, the ability to be simultaneously savior and destroyer, depending on which door you entered through. On a crisp October morning that year, he stood before thousands of Chicago's citizens on the South Side, his silver hair catching autumn sunlight as he laid the cornerstone of the Armour Institute of Technology. The ceremony was orchestrated with the precision of a military parade, clergy in formal vestments, civic leaders in tailcoats, grateful workers in their Sunday finest. His voice carried genuine conviction as he spoke of education as the great equalizer, of providing the children of laborers with opportunities their parents could never afford. The Institute would offer free technical education to young men and women, training them in the practical sciences that would build America's industrial future. When he placed his weathered hand upon the engraved cornerstone and declared it the foundation of opportunity, tears glistened in the eyes of mothers who imagined their sons escaping the brutal labor of the stockyards through the salvation of knowledge. The Armour mission on State Street fed thousands of Chicago's destitute daily, its long lines of desperate souls shuffling through doors to receive soup, bread, and occasional sermons about the dignity of honest labor. Armour personally visited on holidays, distributing food with his own hands, speaking words of encouragement to men whose faces bore the hollow geography of hunger. His donations flowed like tributaries from a great river of wealth. Churches received funds for organs and stained glass. Orphanages expanded their dormitories. The Chicago Symphony benefited from his patronage. In the parlors of Prairie Avenue, among the industrial barons who had transformed Chicago from swampland into the nation's second city, he was respected not merely for his fortune, but for his character, his willingness to share prosperity with the community that had enabled it. He genuinely believed himself a patriarch, an industrial father providentially chosen to uplift his vast economic family. The philanthropy was not performance, but profound conviction, rooted in the Presbyterian soil of his upbringing that taught him wealth carried sacred obligations. He had constructed an elaborate mental architecture that kept his realities separate, like rooms in a mansion connected by doors he never opened. In one room lived the benevolent patriarch who fed the hungry and educated the poor. In another operated the industrial titan who maximized profit through whatever means proved effective. But 3 miles west, beyond the marble facades and manicured lawns, beyond the comfortable distance that wealth purchases from unpleasant realities, a different empire operated under the same name. In the vast industrial complex of the Union Stockyards, where the Armour name was stamped on buildings stretching across city blocks, workers experienced a patriarch of entirely different character. The shifts began before dawn and extended 12 hours into darkness, 6 days each week. Men labored in temperatures that swung between murderous extremes, freezing in refrigerated rooms where carcasses hung like grotesque chandeliers, suffocating on killing floors where steam from scalding tanks mixed with the heat of bodies packed too close together. The air itself was weaponized. In winter, cold penetrated wool coats and numbed fingers until knives slipped and cut flesh instead of fat. In summer, the combination of heat, humidity, and the stench of blood and offal created an atmosphere so thick it seemed solid, making each breath a conscious. Labor. Industrial accidents were not occasional tragedies, but daily certainties calculated into the cost of business. Fingers disappeared into machinery with such regularity that workers developed a grim lottery, betting on which man would lose digits that week. The knives were kept razor-sharp for efficiency, and efficiency demanded speed that made caution impossible. A moment's distraction, a slip on floors perpetually slick with blood and fat, and a blade would find bone instead of gristle. The company doctor, paid by Armour, loyal to Armour, would bandage wounds, declare workers fit or unfit, and send them back to the line or out the gate, with no compensation beyond their final day's wages. In the pickle rooms where meat was cured, men worked in cellars kept just above freezing, floors slippery with brine and ice, air thick with the acrid fog of saltpeter. The tank rooms where waste was rendered into fertilizer trapped workers in suffocating heat and stench strong enough to make visitors vomit instantly. Chemical burns scarred the hands and forearms of men who worked in preservative rooms, mixing white powders whose names they never learned: borax, formaldehyde, salicylic acid, substances that left their skin cracked and weeping, their eyes watering, their lungs burning with metallic taste that lingered long after shifts ended. Tuberculosis haunted the cattle, killing floors like an invisible plague. Workers who processed diseased animals breathed bacteria with every inhalation, their lungs gradually colonized by the same infections that had killed the cattle they butchered. The company maintained no records of occupational disease. When a worker began coughing blood, he was simply replaced, his position filled before his body grew cold. His family received no pension, no compensation, no acknowledgement that the Armour fortune had been built partially on his consumed lungs. When workers organized to protest wage cuts implemented while profit margins soared to unprecedented heights, Armour's managers responded with systematic brutality. Union organizers were identified, blacklisted, and escorted from premises by Pinkerton guards whose loyalty was purchased with Armour money. The blacklist was shared among Chicago's major employers, ensuring troublemakers would find no work in the city. Some organizers simply disappeared, their absence explained by managers as voluntary departures, though whispered rumors suggested darker fates in the maze of killing floors and rendering tanks where bodies could vanish without trace. The psychological compartmentalization required to maintain both realities simultaneously was Armour's most remarkable and terrifying achievement. On Sunday mornings, he sat in the front pew of Fourth Presbyterian Church, his Bible open to passages about charity and stewardship, his voice joining hymns about loving one's neighbor. The sermons about Christian duty resonated in his chest with genuine emotion. He believed himself a faithful servant of God's plan, using talents and opportunities Providence had provided to benefit both himself and his community. On Monday mornings, he reviewed financial reports detailing cost reductions achieved through wage cuts, efficiency improvements gained by speeding the disassembly line beyond safe operating speeds, and profit increases generated by chemical treatments that allowed spoiled meat to be sold rather then discarded. He signed these reports without moral conflict, because in his mind, efficiency and charity were not contradictions, but complementary virtues of industrial progress. The wealth generated by ruthless business practices funded the philanthropic endeavors that salved his conscience and burnished his reputation. This was not hypocrisy in any conventional sense. It was a profound fracture in the man's soul, a Calvinist equation where the suffering of the few became the necessary fuel for the salvation of the many. He could sign a check to build a library in the morning, genuinely weeping over the plight of the uneducated, then spend his afternoon reviewing production reports that could only be achieved by driving his workforce to the brink of exhaustion. The stockyard was a machine governed by iron laws of supply and demand, while the mission was a garden governed by laws of charity. In his fractured consciousness, these worlds never touched. But by 1897, the walls between these compartments were beginning to crack under external pressure. Government inspectors, emboldened by growing public concern about food safety, were asking uncomfortable questions about processing methods and chemical additives. Complaints from military quartermasters about canned beef quality were no longer isolated incidents, but a steady stream of documented grievances. The whispers from the stockyards were growing into a roar that could no longer be dismissed as the whining of malcontents and radicals. Most dangerous of all, a young writer named Upton Sinclair had begun haunting the stockyards with a notebook and an agenda. He interviewed workers in their tenement homes, documented violations with prosecutorial precision, and absorbed stories that Armour's public relations machinery worked tirelessly to suppress. Sinclair was not interested in balance or fairness. He was interested in exposure, in dragging hidden brutality into daylight where it could no longer be explained away by philanthropic gestures. He walked the alleys behind plants where blood ran in sluggish rivulets, heard about barrels of meat salvaged from floors, washed off and repurposed, noted the casual mixing of fresh trimmings, with those just shy of rotten, all ground into sausages that would bear reassuring labels when they reached middle-class tables. Inside the plants, deception escalated to match the scrutiny. To hide spoilage caused by cutting corners, the chemistry department worked overtime. Barrels of preservatives were mixed in secret rooms, concoctions designed to give gray, rotting meat the flushed pink appearance of freshness. They called it preservation, but it was essentially taxidermy for food. The goal was no longer nutrition, but ensuring products survived the journey to consumers' plates without visibly decomposing, regardless of what they did to stomachs. Armour's managers dismissed these gathering threats with characteristic arrogance, assuring him that socialists were a fringe element without real influence, that government inspectors could be managed through political connections and strategic donations, that the public's appetite for cheap meat would always trump abstract concerns about working conditions or chemical additives. They told him what he wanted to hear, and he believed them because the alternative was acknowledging that the empire he had built with such pride was constructed on systematic exploitation and deception. Then, in February 1898, the US Maine exploded in Havana Harbor, and the drumbeat of war began echoing through American newspapers. The Spanish-American War would require provisions on a scale never before attempted. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers would need to be fed across an ocean, in tropical climates that accelerated spoilage, under conditions that demanded preserved rations. The War Department began soliciting bids for the largest meat contract in American history. For Philip Armour, reading the headlines in his Prairie Avenue study, this was not primarily a geopolitical event, but a logistical feast wrapped in patriotic opportunity. The timing seemed providential. He had warehouses full of canned beef that had been treated with preservatives to extend shelf life beyond natural limits, stockpiles of meat that conventional markets were beginning to question. The military contract would absorb this inventory at premium prices, wrapping commercial expediency in the flag of patriotic service. As the Spanish-American War approached, offering the largest meat contract in American history, Armour saw not a patriotic duty but a divine opportunity, a chance to transform his inventory of questionable provisions into a monument to national service. He submitted his bid with confidence, certain that his reputation and capacity would secure the contract. The government, desperate to provision an army being assembled with unprecedented speed, accepted. He announced the contract at a public ceremony, positioning it as his contribution to national defense, proof that American industry could support American valor. He had no idea he was about to feed his empire to the wolves, that the provisions bearing his name would poison not just soldiers but his reputation, that the patriotic opportunity he embraced with such confidence would become the mechanism of his dynasty's destruction. The doors between his compartmentalized realities were about to be kicked open by dying soldiers whose letters home would carry not gratitude but accusations, whose testimonies before Congress would transform the benevolent patriarch into a national villain, whose suffering would finally force America to confront the true cost of industrial efficiency pursued without ethical constraint. February 21st, 1899. In a Senate hearing room that had witnessed the fall of presidents and the birth of nations, Philip R. Moore's empire was about to be dissected with the same efficiency he had once applied to cattle. Washington that winter carried a particular chill, less from the weather than from the moral frost that descends when a nation realizes it has been betrayed from within. The chamber itself felt designed for judgment, a cavern of dark mahogany and brass fixtures where afternoon light filtered through tall windows, illuminating dust motes that danced like the ghosts of soldiers who had not returned from Cuba. The atmosphere was not one of legislative procedure, but of inquisition, a tribunal where the weight of governmental authority pressed down like a physical force. Senators sat behind their elevated dais like grim magistrates, their faces set in expressions ranging from skepticism to open hostility, while the gallery overflowed with reporters, veterans, and citizens who had come to witness the public flaying of an industrial titan. At the center of this theater of accountability sat Major General Nelson Appleton Miles, commanding general of the United States Army. He was a man carved from the old frontier, with a mustache that bristled with indignation and eyes that had seen too much death to be intimidated by corporate wealth. His uniform was immaculate, his bearing erect despite 60 years of age, but his face carried the particular fury of a commander who had watched his soldiers suffer from betrayals that originated not on battlefields, but in boardrooms. On the polished table before him sat a single, government-issued tin of Armour canned beef, its label still bearing patriotic eagles and promises of quality. In this setting, it radiated the menace of a loaded weapon. When General Miles began to speak, his voice was not loud, but it carried the devastating clarity of a man testifying to crimes he had witnessed firsthand. He did not speak in the abstract language of logistics or supply chains. He spoke of the visceral reality of those humid Cuban mornings, of men reduced to hollow-eyed specters, not by Spanish Mausers, but by their own rations. With theatrical precision that silenced the room, he lifted the tin can, holding it aloft and turning it slowly, so the light caught the dull metal. "I call it embalmed beef," he declared, the phrase hanging in the air like a curse. The meat furnished to the army was unwholesome and unfit for human consumption, preserved by the use of chemicals that gave it the taste of embalming fluid. The stenographer's pens scratched furiously, capturing words that would appear in newspapers across the nation within hours. He described opening tins in tropical heat to encounter that same iridescent sheen, the same sickly sweet odor that reminded field surgeons of formaldehyde used to preserve cadavers. He recounted men collapsing with violent cramps minutes after eating, regiments rendered too weak to march, soldiers who could not stand guard because they were doubled over in their tents, retching until nothing remained inside them but air and bitterness. The testimony accumulated like sediment, each layer burying Armour deeper beneath documented suffering. Miles read from letters written by junior officers who had watched their commands weaken, not from enemy fire, but from provisions that poisoned rather than sustained. Private Michael Sullivan of Massachusetts took the stand to describe the taste as like licking a penny mixed with rotten eggs. Sergeant Thomas Bradford of Ohio testified that his entire squad had fallen ill within hours, suffering symptoms the camp doctor could not distinguish from cholera. A hospital steward read from his log, documenting dozens of cases of acute gastritis that coincided precisely with the distribution of armor provisions. Throughout this parade of condemnation, Philip R. Moore sat in the gallery, flanked by attorneys who periodically leaned close to whisper reassurances that rang increasingly hollow. The physical transformation was visible to everyone present. The confident patriarch who had laid cornerstones and distributed charity had been replaced by someone diminished, aged beyond his 67 years by stress that manifested in trembling hands and a gaunt face that seemed to have lost its underlying structure. The man who had commanded an industrial empire with absolute authority now found himself a spectator to his own dismemberment. His legal team attempted damage control with the desperation of surgeons trying to stanch arterial bleeding. They challenged Miles's expertise in meat quality, suggested that tropical conditions rather than processing methods had caused spoilage, and implied that soldiers accustomed to fresh provisions simply found preserved foods unfamiliar rather than unwholesome. They produced their own experts, chemists on the company payroll, who testified that the preservatives were generally recognized as safe in appropriate quantities, conveniently avoiding questions about what constituted appropriate quantities or whether starving soldiers in tropical heat represented typical consumption conditions. But every defense only deepened the wound. To argue that chemical poisoning was standard industry practice was not exoneration, but confession of systemic rot. Each appeal to technical legality collided with the human reality described by surgeons and soldiers who had nothing to gain from lying. Legal compliance could not wash away the taste of embalming fluid or restore life to men who had died not from enemy bullets, but from their own government's provisions. The courtroom drama played out in newspapers with relentless fury. Headlines spun across the country: embalmed beef scandal, army poisoned by contractors, the butcher of Santiago. Editorial cartoons depicted Armour as a grotesque butcher feeding soldiers to machinery, or as a vulture perched atop mountains of contaminated meat. The phrase embalmed beef entered the American vocabulary that afternoon, a linguistic scar that would forever taint the reputation of Chicago's meatpacking industry. The irony was palpable and cruel. The meat king, who had built his fortune by destroying lives with industrial efficiency, 9 million animals annually reduced to packaged commodities, was now being consumed by his own creation. The machine he had engineered with such pride, the system that transformed living creatures into profit with mechanical precision, had finally turned its appetite toward him. The destroyer was being destroyed, not by external enemies, but by the inexorable logic of his own methods applied to his reputation. As the hearings stretched across weeks, journalists noted Armour's continued deterioration in dispatches that mixed schadenfreude with genuine shock. The Chicago Tribune described him as visibly shaken, appearing to have aged a decade in the months since the scandal broke. He had always been a large man, imposing in his physical presence, but now his clothes seemed to hang loosely, as if the substance beneath had somehow diminished. The stress of the Inquisition had hollowed him out, his skin hanging gray and loose on his frame, his hands shaking with a palsy born of rage and fear. Though no criminal charges were ultimately filed, the lawyers had done their work well, ensuring that contracts and inspections provided legal cover even if they offered no moral defense. The court of public opinion delivered a verdict far more devastating than any jury could impose. Armour & Company's stock plummeted as investors recognized that trust, once contaminated, could not be chemically preserved back to freshness. Sales collapsed across the nation as consumers who had once reached automatically for products bearing the Armour name now avoided them with instinctive revulsion. Grocery stores reported that Armour products sat unsold on shelves, while competitors' goods flew off at premium prices. Hotels and restaurants quietly removed his company's name from their menus. The military contracts, that had seemed like providential opportunities, now became monuments to disgrace, physical evidence of the moment when patriotic duty collided with industrial greed and greed won decisively. Foreign markets canceled contracts, with the German government using the scandal as pretext to ban American meat imports entirely. Philip Armour retreated to his Prairie Avenue fortress, but marble walls could not shield him from the whispers that followed his name through every social circle he had once dominated. Former friends crossed streets to avoid conversation. The dynasty he had built with such confidence, believing it would stand for generations as a monument to industrial achievement, was crumbling with the same efficiency he had once applied to his competitors. He had built his empire on the promise that Americans could trust what came in a tin bearing his name, that the Armour brand represented quality, safety, and abundance. It was a covenant as sacred as any religious vow. You will eat this and live, not eat this and die. But trust, once poisoned, proves far more difficult to preserve than meat. No amount of chemical treatment could restore what had been lost in those Cuban camps. No marketing campaign could wash away the testimony of soldiers who had tasted betrayal with every spoonful. The empire would survive. Corporations have remarkable resilience. Their ability to outlast individual reputations, one of capitalism's most terrifying features. But the emperor was already dying, not from bullets or disease, but from the slow, inexorable rot of a reputation beyond redemption. For the first time in his life, Philip Armour's greatest creation was not his company, his mansion, or his institutions. It was doubt. Doubt in American food, doubt in American industry, doubt in the very idea that progress could be trusted when guided by men for whom efficiency mattered more than the sanctity of what they sold. And that doubt, once uncanned, could never be put back inside. Philip Armour died on January 6, 1901, not from poison, but from pneumonia. Yet, in a sense, he had been dying ever since that first soldier spit out his beef in a Cuban jungle. The final years unfolded with the slow, grinding inevitability of a machine breaking down, each component failing in sequence until the entire structure collapsed. The pneumonia that would ultimately kill him was merely the final assault on a constitution already weakened by something far more corrosive than disease, the slow-acting toxin of disgrace that had been eating away at him since the Senate hearings concluded. His massive frame, which had once intimidated competitors and commanded respect in boardrooms across Chicago, shrank inward until his clothes hung loosely on limbs that had lost their vigor. The tremor in his hands that had begun during his Senate testimony never subsided, making even simple tasks like signing documents an exercise in humiliation. He retreated into his Prairie Avenue fortress, but the mansion that had once stood as a monument to industrial achievement now functioned as a mausoleum for the living. The rooms that had hosted Chicago's elite, where champagne had flowed beneath crystal chandeliers and orchestras had played for senators and railroad kings, now echoed with the shuffling footsteps of a man who had become a pariah in the city he helped build. The marble walls, once symbols of his unassailable status, now served only to amplify the silence of a telephone that rarely rang and a doorbell that remained undisturbed by the messengers of high society. He spent his days in his library, surrounded by leather-bound volumes and the artifacts of a life spent conquering markets, staring out windows that offered views of a city that had turned its back on him. The social exile was perhaps more devastating than the financial losses. Chicago's elite society, which had once competed for invitations to Armour functions, now found reasons to be elsewhere when his name appeared on guest lists. Former friends crossed streets to avoid conversation, their eyes sliding away with the practiced indifference of those who fear contamination by association. The clubs where he had once held court, discussing politics, arranging deals, shaping the city's future, now fell silent when he entered, conversations dying like flames starved of oxygen. He would sit alone at his usual table, a ghost haunting his own life, while younger industrialists clustered at distant tables and spoke in voices carefully modulated to exclude him. The whispers followed him everywhere, at the club, in the church pew, even in the respectful nods of servants who read the newspapers and understood that their employer was no longer the benevolent patriarch he had believed himself to be. When death finally arrived on that frigid January morning, it came almost as a mercy. The funeral procession wound through Chicago's winter streets, past snowbanks that had turned gray with coal dust, a fitting visual metaphor for a reputation that had been similarly soiled. Thousands lined the route, but they came not to mourn but to witness, their faces expressing curiosity more than grief. The massive cortege moved slowly through the city he had helped build, past the Union stockyards where his empire still operated under his name, past the Armour Institute where students learned trades that would feed other men's fortunes, past the mission where the poor still received bread. Bearing his brand. At Graceland Cemetery, the Armour Mausoleum stood waiting like a granite fortress, its bronze doors heavy enough to require 3 men to open, designed to withstand centuries and protect even his corpse from the judgment of posterity. But no amount of stone could silence the whispers that would follow his name. No architectural grandeur could restore what had been lost in those Senate hearing rooms. The burden of inheritance fell immediately upon his son, J. Ogden Armour, a man who possessed his father's ambition but lacked the ruthless genius that had built the empire. J. Ogden inherited not merely a company, but a curse, a name that opened doors and simultaneously poisoned every room he entered. The Armour family, once the undisputed aristocracy of Chicago's industrial quarter, found themselves transformed into pariahs in the very circles they had once dominated. Invitations dried up like streams in drought. Social connections that had seemed permanent dissolved like morning frost. Daughters who should have married into other industrial dynasties found themselves politely declined. The family name, which Philip had believed would be his greatest legacy, had become a liability his descendants would spend decades trying to escape or rehabilitate. J. Ogden attempted to restore the family's reputation through aggressive expansion and modernization, but the scandal clung to every transaction like a chemical residue that could not be washed away. Business partners demanded additional guarantees. Customers required extra inspections. The trust that Philip had destroyed could not be rebuilt through efficiency or marketing. It required time measured in generations, and J. Ogden did not have generations. His own financial judgment proved disastrous. In the 1920s, he lost millions in grain speculation, betting on price movements with the same confidence his father had shown in shorting pork during the Civil War. But where Philip's timing had been impeccable, J. Ogden's was catastrophically wrong. The losses forced him to sell controlling interest in Armour and Company, ending the family's direct control of the empire that bore their name. He died in 1927, his fortune depleted, his reputation tarnished not by scandal but by incompetence, perhaps a more thorough humiliation than his father's dramatic fall. The scandal's true legislative aftermath arrived 5 years after Philip's death, delivered by an unlikely executioner, a young socialist writer named Upton Sinclair, whose novel The Jungle exposed the full horror of Chicago's meatpacking industry to a nauseated nation. Published in 1906, the book was intended as an indictment of capitalism's exploitation of workers, but the public seized instead upon its graphic descriptions of contaminated meat, rats ground into sausage, tubercular cattle processed for consumption, workers falling into rendering tank sand, emerging as Durham's pure leaf lard. Sinclair had spent weeks in the stockyards, documenting the very practices Armour had instituted, walking the alleys behind plants where blood ran in sluggish rivulets, hearing about barrels of meat salvaged from floors, washed off and repurposed. The national revulsion was immediate and overwhelming. President Theodore Roosevelt, initially skeptical of Sinclair's socialist leanings, sent his own investigators to Chicago. Their report confirmed the novel's most disturbing allegations, describing conditions even worse than fiction could invent. "I aimed at the public's heart," Sinclair later lamented, "and by accident, I hit it in the stomach." The outrage that had flickered during the embalmed beef scandal now roared into an inferno that no amount of corporate public relations could extinguish. Within months, lawmakers passed the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act on June 30, 1906, the first comprehensive federal regulations of the food industry. These laws mandated government inspection of meat processing facilities, prohibited the use of harmful preservatives, and required accurate labeling of contents. The irony was complete and devastating. The man who had fought all regulation, who had believed that industry could police itself through market forces, had created conditions so appalling that they necessitated the very government intervention he had spent his life opposing. Armour and Company, along with every other meatpacker, was forced to submit to government oversight that Philip Armour would have considered an intolerable intrusion on private enterprise. The fortress of industrial autonomy had been breached. Government inspectors would now stand on the killing floors, empowered to stop the lines, condemn carcasses, and enforce standards that Philip Armour had spent a lifetime evading in the name of efficiency. The institutional monuments he had funded survived, though their relationship to his memory grew increasingly ambiguous. The Armour Institute continued educating Chicago's working class, eventually merging with other institutions to become the Illinois Institute of Technology. Students who walked its halls learned engineering and science, most of them unaware that the name above the door belonged to a man who had poisoned soldiers. The Armour mission continued feeding Chicago's poor. Its daily bread lines a genuine service to the destitute, though one could not help but note the dark symmetry. Food given freely to the poor, while food sold to soldiers had been contaminated with chemicals. These philanthropic monuments functioned as a kind of moral laundering, proof that something good had come from blood-stained money, that guilt could be transmuted into service, even if it could never be erased into innocence. Yet the scales never quite balanced. The monuments stood, but they did not absolve, they complicated. He had built his monuments in marble and steel, believing they would outlast memory, that physical permanence could triumph over historical judgment. But history has a different kind of preservation in mind, one that keeps the rot as fresh as the day it first spoiled, that refuses to let time soften the edges of genuine harm. While the physical meat decayed and vanished, the memory of the betrayal remained perfectly preserved in the national consciousness. The scandal became a permanent chapter in American history textbooks, a cautionary tale about unchecked capitalism that would be taught to generations of schoolchildren long after the last armor factory had closed its doors. The question that haunted his deathbed would outlive every building bearing his name, echoing through the century of regulation and consumer skepticism that followed. What is the true cost of feeding a nation on lies? It was a question that Philip Armour died without answering, leaving the response to be written in the laws and regulations that stand as the true, unintended monument to his life's work, a legacy measured not in marble and steel, but in the permanent erosion of the very trust he had spent a lifetime exploiting. Walk through any American supermarket today, and Philip Armour's ghost walks beside you, wrapped in plastic, priced by the pound, regulated by laws written in the blood of poisoned soldiers. The aisles stretch in geometric precision under fluorescent light that hums with the same relentless frequency as the machinery he once commanded. The meat cases display their contents like glass-fronted altars, styrofoam trays, and plastic wrap, creating a uniformity that would have been impossible before his disassembly lines perfected the art of standardization. Shoppers move past these refrigerated displays with unconscious confidence, selecting packages based on price and appearance, trusting that expiration dates are accurate and that the meat beneath the plastic is safe. They do not ask where it came from, how many hands touched it, or what chemicals preserve its appealing pink color. That unquestioning trust is Philip Armour's most enduring and complicated inheritance. He did not invent meatpacking, but he perfected something far more consequential, the industrialization of eating itself. Before Armour and his Chicago Confederates, food was largely local and seasonal. You bought meat from a butcher who knew the farmer who raised the animal, could see and smell and judge the product with your own senses. Armour shattered that intimacy, transforming food from a relationship into a transaction. By harnessing railroads, refrigeration, and mechanization, he made meat a national commodity rather than a local product. Cattle raised in Texas, slaughtered in Chicago, eaten in New York, this was his alchemy of distance and efficiency. Every refrigerated truck thundering down an interstate highway, every vast processing plant tucked away in rural counties, every vacuum-sealed package that allows meat to travel thousands of miles without visibly aging, Each traces its lineage to his Chicago empire. The convenience is so complete, so seamlessly integrated into modern life, that it has become invisible, which is precisely what Armour intended when he pioneered this system of abundant opacity. The nation's response to his betrayal created a new kind of architecture, not of marble and mahogany, but of legislation and bureaucracy. The Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act, followed by the creation of what became the Food and Drug Administration, were hammered into existence by outrage. Every nutrition label, every USDA inspection stamp, every recall announcement is part of that defensive rampart regulatory scar tissue formed over wounds inflicted by an industry that chose profit over public health. Walk through that modern supermarket and examine the labels that Armour would have found incomprehensible. Nutrition facts panels listing every ingredient, expiration dates calculated with scientific precision, inspection stamps certifying government oversight, allergen warnings protecting the vulnerable. These are not voluntary disclosures but legal requirements, each one written in response to some past betrayal. The very existence of food safety standards is an unspoken accusation that, left entirely to their own devices, companies will choose quarterly earnings over consumer welfare every time. His scandal became the foundation stone of consumer protection law, an unintended monument carved not in stone, but in regulations and enforcement protocols. Yet for all these protections, the deeper questions Armour raised have never been resolved. They have merely been repackaged in modern forms. What are we willing to ignore for convenience? How much trust do we place in systems designed primarily for profit rather than safety? The same tensions that destroyed his reputation continue to plague contemporary food production. Factory farms still crowd animals into conditions that accelerate disease, then rely on antibiotics to keep them alive just long enough to be profitable. Processing plants still run lines so fast that workers' bodies break, just as surely as knives once slipped in the cold rooms of Chicago. Marketing departments wrap these realities in images of sunlit pastures and family farms, the language of natural and wholesome functioning as a new kind of chemical preservative, not for the meat, but for the conscience. Modern food recalls. 4E. Coli contamination, salmonella outbreaks, undisclosed allergens demonstrate that the battle Armour lost is still being fought. The scale has changed, the specific contaminants have evolved, but the underlying dynamic remains. Corporations seeking to maximize efficiency and minimize cost, sometimes at the expense of those who consume their products. The difference is that now we have systems to detect and respond to these failures. But the fundamental equation of capitalism, profit versus protection, remains unchanged. Philip R. Moore believed that efficiency was a form of morality, that to feed the masses cheaply was to serve both God and country. In his Presbyterian worldview, industrial progress represented divine will made manifest, the application of human ingenuity to solve ancient problems of scarcity and hunger. He genuinely saw himself as a benefactor, using talents Providence had provided to transform the chaotic inefficiency of traditional butchery into a system that could feed a continent. The philanthropy was not hypocrisy, but the natural expression of this conviction. But he never grasped that efficiency without ethics is not progress, it's predation. Speed without scrutiny, mechanization without morality, profit without principle, these do not represent the triumph of human ingenuity, but its corruption. He fed a nation, but he also taught it to stop asking where the food came from, what it contained, or what it cost in human suffering. The distance he created between production and consumption was not merely physical, but moral, allowing consumers to enjoy abundance without confronting the reality of how that abundance was achieved. In the end, Armour's story is not merely about meat or money, it's about the American faith in industrial progress, the quasi-religious belief that if something can be done faster, cheaper, and more efficiently, it should be done, regardless of consequence. He built his empire on that faith, and that faith ultimately consumed him. He was the embodiment of the Gilded Age's terrifying energy, a man who could look at a living creature and see only a sum of profitable parts, who could look at a poisoned soldier and see only a contract fulfilled. The Union stockyards, his earthly kingdom, were demolished in 1971, their brick walls knocked down and killing floors shattered into rubble. Today, grass grows over soil, still stained with the blood of millions. But the system he pioneered has simply dispersed and multiplied, becoming the invisible operating system of our daily lives. The Meat King is buried beneath tons of marble in Graceland Cemetery, sealed in a mausoleum that resembles a fortress. But his empire lives on in every processed meal, every industrial farm, every time we choose convenience over conscience. The question he left carved in American stone remains as fresh as the day he first asked it, though he never consciously posed it. How much are we willing to swallow in exchange for abundance? What are we prepared to ignore about the origins of our food, the conditions of its production, the suffering involved in creating it? We answer these questions every day at the checkout counter, usually without realizing we are answering them at all. Philip Danforth Armour died believing he had fed a nation. History suggests he may have been right. He did transform America from a nation of farmers into a nation of consumers, filling plates with protein that fueled the industrial age. But the meal is still being digested, and the final cost has yet to be calculated. We are still sitting at his table, eating the feast he prepared, hoping that this time the price we pay won't be more than we can bear. His ghost walks beside us still, wrapped in plastic and priced by the pound, reminding us that trust, once poisoned, requires constant vigilance to prevent its contamination again.